Hello everyone, I am the boring historian, and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. The shores of the Thames River have borne witness to countless human dramas throughout the centuries, but perhaps none so solemn as the public executions that punctuated life in early medieval London. As the mists rise from the river in the early morning, one can almost imagine the crowds gathering, their breath visible in the cold air, as they assemble to witness the ultimate demonstration of royal authority and social control, the taking of a human life as punishment for crime. London's history of public execution stretches back to its earliest days as a settlement following the Roman withdrawal from Britain in the 5th century. The transformation from Roman Londinium to the Anglo-Saxon settlement of Londonwick marked not only a change in the urban landscape, but also in systems of governance and justice. Where once stood the ordered Roman courts and their systematic approach to law, the early medieval period saw the development of distinctly Anglo-Saxon legal traditions, blending Germanic customary law with emerging Christian moral frameworks. The early medieval period, roughly spanning from the 5th to the 11th century, represented a crucial time in the development of England's judicial systems. During this era, London gradually established itself as a center of commerce, religion, and royal authority. With this growing prominence came the need for visible demonstrations of power and control. Public executions served this purpose with grim efficiency. As one contemporary chronicler noted, "The sight of the condemned upon the gallows serves to remind all who see it of the king's justice and the wages of sin." This dual purpose, secular punishment and moral instruction, characterized public execution throughout the period, making it not merely a judicial act, but a social and cultural phenomenon deeply embedded in the fabric of early medieval society. The archaeological record offers tantalizing glimpses into this dark chapter of London's past. Excavations along the Thames foreshore have revealed the remains of individuals who met violent ends, their bones bearing silent testimony to the brutality of early medieval justice. Among these, the remarkable discovery in 1991 of a woman executed between 680 to 810 AD, now known as the Lady of the Thames, provides a rare window into the practice of execution and corpse display during this period. Her remains, bearing evidence of prolonged beating before death by blunt force trauma to the head, speak to the severe physical punishment that could precede the final execution. London, which would later gain the ominous nickname the City of Gallows during the later medieval and early modern periods, began establishing its reputation for public punishment during these early centuries. While the spectacle of mass public executions that would characterize Tudor London lay centuries in the future, the foundations of this practice and the social attitudes surrounding it were being laid during the Anglo-Saxon period. This historical narrative seeks to explore the multifaceted reality of execution in early medieval London, not merely as a sequence of gruesome events, but as a complex social institution that reflected and shaped the values, fears, and power structures of its time. Through examination of archaeological evidence, historical documents, and the broader context of Anglo-Saxon England, we will reconstruct the world in which these executions took place and the people whose lives and deaths were defined by them. The story of execution in early medieval London is ultimately the story of a society grappling with fundamental questions of justice, authority, morality, and social order. By understanding how early Londoners approached these questions through the institution of public execution, we gain insight not only into their world, but into the deeper human impulses that continue to shape our own relationship with justice and punishment. The development of legal frameworks in Anglo-Saxon England provides the essential context for understanding execution practices in early medieval London. Before a condemned person ever reached the execution ground, they had passed through a complex system of laws, judgments, and sentencing that reflected the evolving nature of Anglo-Saxon society and governance. Through examination of archaeological evidence, historical documents, and the broader context of Anglo-Saxon England, we will reconstruct the world in which these executions took place and the people whose lives and deaths were defined by them. The story of execution in early medieval London is ultimately the story of a society grappling with fundamental questions of justice, authority, morality, and social order. By understanding how early Londoners approached these questions through the institution of public execution, we gain insight not only into their world, but into the deeper human impulses that continue to shape our own relationship with justice and punishment. The development of legal frameworks in Anglo-Saxon England provides the essential context for understanding execution practices in early medieval London. Before a condemned person ever reached the execution ground, they had passed through a complex system of laws, judgments, and sentencing that reflected the evolving nature of Anglo-Saxon society and governance. The earliest written Anglo-Saxon law code, attributed to King Ethelbert of Kent, reigned c. 589 through 1616, notably contained no provisions for corporal punishment. Instead, it relied heavily on the concept of monetary compensation, or weregild, man price, a system in which offenses from injury to murder could be settled through payment to the victim or their family. This approach reflected the early Anglo-Saxon preference for maintaining social peace through reconciliation rather than retribution. The monetary compensation system was carefully calibrated according to social status. In the laws of Ethelbert, the weregild for killing a freeman was set at 100 shillings, while that for a nobleman might be several times higher. This system created a legal framework in which one's worth, both living and in death, was explicitly tied to social standing. For those unable to pay, the consequences could be severe, potentially including enslavement or exile. As Anglo-Saxon kingdoms developed more sophisticated governmental structures in the 7th and 8th centuries, written law codes became more comprehensive and began to incorporate new approaches to punishment. The introduction of corporal punishment, including beatings for those unable to pay fines, marked a significant shift toward physical penalties rather than purely financial ones. The reign of King Alfred the Great, 871 to 899, represented a watershed moment in the development of Anglo-Saxon law and punishment practices. Alfred's legal code dramatically expanded the scope of crimes punishable by death, reflecting both his desire to strengthen royal authority. A contemporary manuscript illumination depicts King Alfred presiding over a court case, his figure elevated above others to symbolize his role as the ultimate source of justice. Below him, scribes record his judgments, while guards stand ready to carry out sentences. This visual representation captures the increasingly centralized nature of justice under Alfred and his successors. The influence of the Church on Anglo-Saxon legal development cannot be overstated. As Christianity became firmly established throughout England, ecclesiastical authorities increasingly shaped attitudes toward crime and punishment. The concept of sin became intertwined with that of crime, and physical punishment came to be seen as potentially redemptive, a means of purging sin through suffering before death. This religious dimension added layers of meaning to execution beyond mere punishment or deterrence. As one 9th century homily stated, "The pain of the body may cleanse the soul of its corruption if borne with proper contrition." This perspective gave execution a spiritual significance that complicated its role as a purely judicial act. In London specifically, the application of these evolving legal principles was shaped by the city's unique status and development. Following its re-establishment as a significant settlement in the 7th century, London gradually became an important center of royal power. King Alfred's recapture of London from Viking control in 886 and the subsequent restoration of the city marked the beginning of London's emergence as a crucial administrative center. The physical infrastructure of justice in early medieval London reflected this growing importance. While formal court buildings would not become common until the later medieval period, open-air legal assemblies known as folkmoot and husting were held at regular intervals. These public gatherings, often taking place at significant locations such as St. Paul's Cathedral or the site that would later become Guildhall, served as venues for the administration of justice and the pronouncement of sentences. Archaeological evidence from execution sites around London supports the written record's indication that capital punishment was relatively rare during this period. Execution cemeteries, while established from the 7th and 8th centuries onward, typically contain relatively few interments, suggesting an average of approximately one execution per decade. This rarity would have made each execution a significant event, drawing attention and spectators from throughout the region. The types of crimes that could lead to execution evolved throughout the period. Early Anglo-Saxon law primarily reserved death for repeat offenders or those caught in the act of serious crimes such as murder or theft. By the late Anglo-Saxon period, the list of capital offenses had expanded to include treason, arson, some forms of witchcraft, and certain sexual offenses deemed particularly sinful, such as incest. Intriguingly, written sources and archaeological evidence suggest significant regional variation in the application of capital punishment. Local customs, the influence of powerful nobles, and practical considerations all affected how and when execution was employed as a punishment. This regional variation reminds us that despite the growing centralization of Anglo-Saxon government, justice remained, in many ways, a local affair, shaped by specific community contexts and power dynamics. By the end of the early medieval period, London's legal framework had evolved significantly from the simple compensation system of Ethelbert. A more complex understanding of crime, sin, and punishment had emerged, one that would set the stage for the more elaborate execution rituals of the later medieval period. The foundations had been laid for London's eventual reputation as the City of Gallows, though the scale and spectacle of execution would increase dramatically in centuries to come. Documentary sources provide additional detail about corpse display practices. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle mentions traitors whose bodies were set upon poles outside city gates or at boundary markers. Similarly, law codes from the reigns of Ethelstan and Canute explicitly mention the display of executed thieves at crossroads and other public locations. The duration of corpse display varied according to the crime and social status of the executed. Common thieves might be displayed for days or weeks, while political traitors could remain on display for months or even years. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records that the head of Earl Edric, executed for treason against King Canute in 1017, was set upon the gate of London, where it remained for an extended period, a practice that would become increasingly common in later medieval London. The locations chosen for corpse display held symbolic significance. City gates represented thresholds between the ordered space within and the potentially dangerous world beyond, making them potent locations for displaying the consequences of transgression. Similarly, bridges, crossroads, and territorial boundaries served as liminal spaces appropriate for the display of those who had crossed social and moral boundaries through their crimes. Weather and natural decay processes eventually necessitated the removal of displayed corpses. At this point, the remains would typically be buried in execution cemeteries or disposed of in rivers or other marginal locations. Documentary sources suggest that responsibility for this final disposal often fell to the community where the execution took place, representing a financial and practical burden that added to the punitive nature of execution. The practice of corpse display reveals much about Anglo-Saxon attitudes toward death and punishment. By transforming the criminal's body into a public spectacle and warning, authorities extended the punitive and deterrent aspects of execution beyond the moment of death itself. The criminal's corpse became a potent symbol, its public display reinforcing social boundaries and the consequences of transgression. Among the archaeological evidence for execution in early medieval London, few discoveries have provided as much insight as the remains known as the Lady of the Thames. Discovered during archaeological excavations of the Thames foreshore in 1991, this female skeleton, dating to 680 to 810 AD, offers a remarkable case study in Anglo-Saxon execution practices and corpse treatment. Forensic analysis of the remains revealed a complex pattern of injuries consistent with prolonged punishment before death. The woman, estimated to have been between 26 to 35 years old at death, showed evidence of multiple blunt force traumas to her skull and body, many partially healed, suggesting repeated beatings over an extended period. The final cause of death appears to have been a severe blow to the head, consistent with execution by clubbing as described in Anglo-Saxon law codes for female thieves. The location where her remains were found, at the edge of the Thames, in what would have been the liminal space between water and land, aligns with documentary descriptions of execution sites. The positioning suggests her body may have been deliberately placed at the river's edge for display, before eventually being incorporated into the river sediment through natural processes. Isotope analysis of her teeth and bones indicates she was likely local to the London area, while wear patterns on her teeth and skeletal markers suggest a life of physical labor consistent with lower social status. No grave goods or evidence of formal burial accompanied her remains, reinforcing her likely status as an executed criminal denied normal funerary rites. The Lady of the Thames represents a unique opportunity to connect archaeological evidence with documentary accounts of Anglo-Saxon justice. Her remains align closely with written descriptions of female execution for theft, the use of beating rather than hanging, the disposal of the body at the river's edge, and the denial of formal burial. Her case provides tangible evidence of gendered aspects of Anglo-Saxon punishment, where different execution methods were employed based on the sex of the criminal. Moreover, the date range of her remains places her firmly within the period when London was transitioning from a relatively minor settlement to an increasingly important center of trade and royal power. Her execution may thus represent an example of the growing assertion of centralized authority in London during this formative period, authority expressed through public punishment and corpse display. The Lady of the Thames reminds us that behind the documentary accounts and archaeological patterns lie individual lives and deaths. Each execution represented not merely the abstract working of a judicial system, but the end of a specific person's life, a reality that archaeological discoveries make tangible in ways written sources alone cannot. Public execution in early medieval London functioned not merely as a judicial procedure, but as a complex social performance with multiple participants, audiences, and meanings. The spectacle of punishment brought together diverse elements of Anglo-Saxon society, creating a powerful ritual that reinforced authority, defined community boundaries, and provided a stage for the expression of both official power and popular response. The performative nature of execution began well before the final moment of death. From the pronouncement of sentences to the disposal of the body, each stage of the process involved carefully choreographed elements designed to maximize its impact on witnesses. Contemporary accounts describe the formal language used in sentencing, the deliberate routing of execution processions through populous areas, and the staging of the execution itself at elevated or otherwise visible locations. The performance aspect of execution served multiple purposes. For authorities, it demonstrated their power to control life and death, reinforcing the social order through visible exercise of legitimate violence. For the condemned, it provided an opportunity to perform their own role, typically that of the penitent sinner seeking redemption through acceptance of punishment. For spectators, it offered not only entertainment, but participation in a communal ritual that defined group boundaries and values. Documentary sources from the period suggest that executions were announced in advance, allowing crowds to gather at the designated location. A 10th century account describes how word was spread throughout the town that justice would be done upon the thief at midday, that all might see and take warning. This advance notice ensured a sufficient audience for the spectacle to achieve its full effect. The timing of executions typically coincided with periods of high public activity, market days, or religious festivals, further increasing the potential audience. This timing was not coincidental, but reflected a deliberate strategy to maximize the number of witnesses to the demonstration of authority. Archaeological evidence for execution sites suggest they were chosen partly for their capacity to accommodate crowds. The elevated locations often selected for executions would have allowed spectators to arrange themselves around the central action, creating a natural amphitheater for the unfolding drama. Similarly, the use of city gates, bridges, and other public infrastructure as display locations for executed bodies ensured maximum visibility to passers-by. While direct evidence for crowd sizes in early medieval London remains limited, documentary sources suggest executions could attract substantial audiences. A 9th century account mentions great throngs of people gathering for the execution of a notorious thief, while later Anglo-Saxon chronicles refer to multitudes witnessing the punishment of traitors. The composition of these crowds likely reflected the diverse population of London itself. Archaeological evidence from the period indicates a growing and increasingly diverse urban population, including Anglo-Saxon, Scandinavian, and Frankish elements. Executions thus served as occasions where different segments of society came together, momentarily united as witnesses to official punishment despite their various backgrounds. The behavior of execution crowds appears to have varied according to the nature of the crime and the identity of the criminal. Documentary sources suggest sympathetic responses to some condemned individuals, particularly those perceived as unjustly accused or those who maintained dignity in the face of death. Conversely, perpetrators of particularly heinous crimes might face active hostility from spectators who would jeer or throw objects at the condemned during their final moments. Religious authorities attempted to regulate crowd behavior at executions, encouraging solemn reflection rather than celebratory or abusive responses. A 10th century homily admonishes Christians to witness punishment with gravity and prayer, not with laughter or mockery, for even the sinner remains God's creature. The frequency with which such admonitions appear in religious texts suggests that controlling crowd behavior at executions represented an ongoing challenge for authorities. Archaeological and documentary evidence suggests women faced execution less frequently than men in Anglo-Saxon London, but when they did, their experiences differed significantly from those of male criminals. Gender influenced every aspect of the execution process, from the crimes for which women might be condemned to the methods used to end their lives. The Lady of the Thames, discussed previously, provides rare archaeological evidence of female execution during this period. The pattern of injuries on her remains, multiple blunt force traumas consistent with beating to death, aligns with documentary descriptions of execution methods considered appropriate for women. Anglo-Saxon law codes specifically mention clubbing, beating with wooden staves, as a punishment for female thieves, while prescribing hanging for male thieves convicted of identical crimes. Drowning represented another execution method associated primarily with women. The laws of Ethelred II specifically prescribe drowning for female slaves who commit theft, while documentary sources mention this method being employed for women convicted of infanticide or certain sexual offenses. Archaeological evidence from riverside locations has uncovered female remains with evidence of binding at wrists and ankles, suggesting victims who may have been executed by drowning. The gendered nature of execution methods reflected broader Anglo-Saxon attitudes toward appropriate treatment of male and female bodies. Hanging, with its public elevation and potential for bodily exposure, was considered unseemly for women, whose modesty remained a concern even in death. Drowning and beating, while no less lethal, allowed for greater preservation of physical dignity, aligning with cultural values regarding female propriety. The crimes for which women faced execution also differed from those that typically brought men to the gallows. While theft, murder, and treason could lead to execution regardless of gender, women were particularly vulnerable to accusations of witchcraft, poisoning, infanticide, and sexual crimes such as adultery. These offenses reflected female spheres of influence and cultural anxieties about women's potential to disrupt social order through occult means, manipulation of intimate relationships, or rejection of maternal roles. Documentary sources suggest women condemned to death often faced heightened scrutiny regarding their demeanor and emotional responses. A 10th century account describes a woman convicted of poisoning her husband who went to her death with unseemly wailing and pleas for mercy, contrasting her behavior with the ideal of dignified acceptance exemplified by a male thief executed the same day. This gendered expectation of proper behavior extended to the execution itself, with women expected to demonstrate both penitence and composure despite their fear. Social status profoundly influenced how individuals experienced execution in early medieval London. From the method of death to the treatment of the corpse, clear distinctions existed between the execution of nobles and commoners, reflecting the highly stratified nature of Anglo-Saxon society. Beheading, as previously discussed, represented the privileged form of execution reserved primarily for nobles and high-status individuals. This method, which required skill to perform swiftly and offered a relatively quick death, contrasted sharply with the slower, more painful methods typically employed for commoners. Archaeological evidence from execution cemeteries shows this distinction clearly, with remains bearing signs of decapitation typically accompanied by grave goods or other indicators of higher status. The spectacle of execution evoked complex emotional responses from those who witnessed it. Fear, particularly fear of suffering a similar fate, represented one intended response, serving the deterrent function of public punishment. Contemporary accounts frequently mention the terror inspired by execution displays, suggesting this emotional impact was recognized and deliberately cultivated by authorities. Yet fear coexisted with other, sometimes contradictory emotions. Documentary evidence suggests executions also functioned as a form of public entertainment in a society with limited recreational opportunities. A 10th century account describes spectators bringing food and drink to an execution, creating an atmosphere more akin to a festival than a solemn judicial proceeding. This entertainment aspect of execution would become more pronounced in later medieval and early modern periods, but appears to have been present even in Anglo-Saxon London. For many spectators, witnessing execution may have provided a form of emotional catharsis, a safe outlet for expressing violent impulses through identification with legitimate authority rather than personal action. By participating in communal punishment, individuals could experience the satisfaction of seeing justice done without themselves engaging in unauthorized violence.
Religious texts from the period suggest authorities recognized these complex emotional dynamics and attempted to channel them in appropriate directions. Homilies urged witnesses to feel appropriate horror at the sin that led to punishment, satisfaction at justice being served, and compassion for the suffering of the condemned, a careful balancing of emotional responses that served both spiritual and social purposes. The physical arrangement of execution spectacles reflected and reinforced social hierarchies. Archaeological and documentary evidence suggest a consistent spatial organization at execution sites, with authorities positioned prominently, the condemned at the center, and spectators arranged according to status. Representatives of royal or civic authority typically occupied elevated positions overlooking the execution, visibly associating themselves with the punishment, while maintaining physical separation from its actual implementation. Religious officials stood closer to the condemned, reflecting their role in facilitating repentance and offering spiritual comfort. The executioner and his assistants operated in the central space, while spectators arranged themselves around this core, with higher status individuals often granted better viewing positions. This spatial hierarchy reinforced the social order, even as the disruptive potential of execution, its violence and emotional intensity, threatened to undermine it. By physically organizing participants according to their social roles, authorities channeled the powerful emotions generated by public punishment into patterns that ultimately strengthened rather than challenged existing power structures. The spectacle of punishment in early medieval London thus represented a complex social ritual that served multiple functions simultaneously. It demonstrated authority, defined community boundaries, provided entertainment, offered emotional catharsis, and reinforced social hierarchies, all while ostensibly serving the primary judicial purpose of punishing crime and deterring future offenses. Understanding execution as performance helps explain its persistence as a social institution, despite its obvious brutality, as it fulfilled psychological and social needs that extended well beyond simple punishment. The experience of execution in early medieval London varied dramatically depending on who the condemned was. Their gender, social status, age, and origin all shaped how they were tried, sentenced, punished, and remembered. These differences reveal much about Anglo-Saxon social structures, illuminating how intersecting aspects of identity determined one's treatment within the judicial system.
Beyond the method itself, status influenced numerous other aspects of execution. Higher status criminals might be granted privacy rather than full public exposure, the right to wear fine clothing to their execution, the opportunity to speak at length before death, religious consolation, including communion, proper burial, sometimes even in consecrated ground, preservation of property for their heirs rather than confiscation. Lower status individuals, conversely, faced more public humiliation, potentially prolonged suffering, limited religious consolation, and dishonorable disposal of their remains. Archaeological evidence from execution cemeteries shows clear status distinctions in burial treatment, with higher status individuals more likely to receive proper orientation and preparation of the body despite their criminal status. Documentary sources suggest status could sometimes protect individuals from execution entirely. The Anglo-Saxon practice of weregild
Man price, monetary compensation paid by killers to victims' families, remained an option primarily available to those with sufficient resources. Similarly, the ability to secure oath helpers who would swear to one's character in court depended largely on social connections associated with higher status. The intersection of status with other factors created complex hierarchies of treatment within the execution system. A high-status woman, for instance, might face gender-appropriate execution methods, drowning rather than hanging, but receive status-appropriate considerations regarding burial and treatment of property. Similarly, a low-status foreigner faced compounded disadvantages compared to either low-status locals or high-status foreigners. Age represented another factor influencing execution practices in Anglo-Saxon London, though evidence for age-specific treatment remains more limited than that for gender or status differences. Documentary sources suggest certain age-related thresholds determined criminal responsibility and potential punishment. Laws of King Ethelstan specifically mention 12 years as the minimum age for capital punishment, stating that no child younger than 12 should be executed unless they have committed multiple serious offenses showing clear criminal intent. Archaeological evidence partly supports this documentary claim, with execution cemetery remains rarely including individuals younger than adolescents. For older individuals, documentary sources suggest some leniency might be extended based on age, particularly for minor offenses. The laws of King Alfred mention that the very aged might receive reduced penalties for certain crimes, though this consideration appears not to have extended to serious offenses like murder or treason. The intersection of age with other factors created additional complexities. Young women appear to have faced particular scrutiny regarding sexual behavior, with execution a possible consequence for perceived promiscuity or infanticide resulting from concealed pregnancy. Conversely, elderly, high-status individuals might receive considerable leniency, even for serious offenses, reflecting the respect accorded to age within Anglo-Saxon noble culture. Archaeological evidence from execution cemeteries reveals relatively few remains of very young or very old individuals, suggesting that the most extreme penalties were indeed primarily reserved for those in the prime of life. This pattern aligns with documentary evidence indicating that both the very young and very old might receive alternative punishments, such as enslavement, mutilation, or exile rather than execution. As a growing trading center, early medieval London contained diverse populations, including not only Anglo-Saxons but also Scandinavians, Franks, and others. The treatment of these others within the execution system reveals much about how Anglo-Saxon society defined its boundaries and managed intercultural tensions.
Documentary sources suggest foreigners faced particular challenges within the Anglo-Saxon legal system. Without established local connections, they struggled to find oath helpers who could vouch for their character, a significant disadvantage in a judicial system that placed considerable weight on such testimonials. The laws of Ethelred II specifically address the issue of foreigners accused of crimes, establishing special procedures that acknowledged their vulnerable position while still maintaining community protection. Archaeological evidence provides some support for differential treatment of foreigners in execution contexts. Isotope analysis of remains from execution cemeteries occasionally identifies individuals who grew up outside the local area, suggesting their status as outsiders may have contributed to their judicial fate. In some cases, these individuals show distinctive burial treatments that further mark their outsider status, such as unusual positioning or separation from other burials. Religious differences represented another dimension of otherness that could influence execution practices. As Christianity became firmly established throughout Anglo-Saxon England, those who adhered to other faiths, whether traditional Germanic paganism, Norse religions brought by Viking settlers, or Jewish beliefs, faced increased scrutiny and potential persecution. Documentary sources mention execution as a punishment for persistent adherence to pagan practices, while archaeological evidence occasionally suggests religious outsiders received distinctive burial treatment following execution. The concept of otherness extended beyond geographical or religious difference to include those perceived as existing outside normal social categories. Individuals accused of witchcraft, those with physical or mental differences, or those who transgressed fundamental social boundaries through their behavior, could all find themselves categorized as dangerous others deserving of exceptional punishment. The treatment of these various others within the execution system highlights how public punishment served not only to address specific crimes, but to define community boundaries, demonstrating who belonged within the social order and what happened to those who existed at its margins. By publicly punishing those defined as outsiders, authorities reinforced a sense of community identity among insiders, while warning of the consequences of failing to conform to established norms. The differential treatment of individuals based on gender, status, age, and origin reveals execution in early medieval London as not simply a uniform judicial process, but a highly differentiated system that reflected and reinforced complex social hierarchies. These variations complicate any simplistic understanding of Anglo-Saxon justice, revealing instead a nuanced system in which identity profoundly shaped how one might experience the ultimate punishment. Behind the religious symbolism and judicial purpose of execution lay practical economic considerations that shaped how punishment was administered in early medieval London. From the status and payment of executioners to the confiscation of criminals' property, economic factors influenced every aspect of the execution system, creating financial incentives that helped sustain the practice beyond its purely punitive functions. Documentary evidence suggests that early medieval London, like most Anglo-Saxon settlements, lacked a permanent professional executioner. Instead, execution duties fell to various individuals depending on the context, creating a complex picture of who actually performed these deadly tasks. For routine executions of common criminals, documentary sources indicate that the responsibility often fell to minor officials associated with local governance, reeves assistants, jailers, or others involved in law enforcement. These individuals received payment for each execution performed, creating a financial incentive for carrying out these grim duties. A reference in a late Anglo-Saxon legal text mentions 4 pence.
4 pence paid to he who places the rope, suggesting standardized compensation for hanging criminals. For higher profile executions, particularly those involving political enemies or nobles, the executioner might be of higher status, sometimes a warrior or retainer of the authority ordering the execution. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicles account of Edric Strona's execution mentions that Earl Eric struck him down, indicating that a nobleman performed the executioner of another nobleman, maintaining the social hierarchies even in death. Despite receiving payment for their services, those who regularly performed executions appear to have suffered social stigmatization. Documentary sources suggest executioners often lived apart from the main community, while archaeological evidence indicates they might be buried in separate areas of cemeteries or with distinctive ritual treatments. This social marginalization reflected the ambiguous position of executioners, necessary to the judicial system, yet tainted by their association with death and violence. The economic status of executioners likely varied considerably depending on their primary occupation and the frequency with which they performed executions. For those who carried out executions only occasionally as part of broader duties, the payment represented a supplement to their regular income. For others who specialized in this function, particularly in later periods as professional executioners began to emerge, execution payments might constitute their primary livelihood. Interestingly, documentary sources suggest executioners sometimes received additional income from secondary aspects of their role. The clothes and personal effects of the executed often became the property of the executioner, a valuable perquisite in a society where textiles represented significant value. Similarly, executioners might profit from selling items associated with executions, such as pieces of the rope used in hanging, which were believed to possess magical properties. The physical infrastructure of execution represented another economic dimension of capital punishment. While early execution sites were often rudimentary, documentary evidence suggests growing investment in execution grounds as the Anglo-Saxon period progressed, creating ongoing costs that had to be managed by local authorities. Gallows construction represented the most obvious expense associated with execution grounds. Early gallows were likely simple wooden structures, but archaeological and documentary evidence suggests these were gradually replaced by more substantial, permanent installations at established execution sites. A reference in a charter from the reign of Edward the Confessor mentions the upkeep of the king's gallows, suggesting ongoing maintenance costs beyond initial construction. Beyond the gallows themselves, execution grounds required other infrastructure: barriers to control crowd movement, platforms for officials overseeing the proceedings, and sometimes specialized equipment for particular execution methods. Documentary sources mention expenses for chains and irons used to secure criminals before execution, and for displaying their bodies afterward. The transportation of criminals to execution sites created additional costs, particularly when the condemned had to be brought from distant locations to centralized execution grounds. Records mention payments for carts, guards, and provisions during these journeys, expenses that increased as execution became more centralized under growing royal authority. Responsibility for these costs typically fell to local communities through various taxation mechanisms. Documentary sources mention the gallows penny, a specific tax levied to maintain execution infrastructure, while archaeological evidence for execution grounds often shows them positioned at the boundaries between administrative districts, possibly to share costs between communities.
The economic burden of maintaining execution grounds may explain certain patterns visible in the archaeological record. The reuse of prehistoric monuments as execution sites, for instance, likely reflected not only symbolic considerations, but practical economic ones. These existing earthworks provided elevated platforms for gallows without requiring new construction. Similarly, the positioning of execution sites at territorial boundaries allowed multiple communities to share the financial burden of their maintenance. The public nature of execution created economic opportunities beyond the official judicial system. As crowds gathered to witness punishments, secondary economies emerged to serve their needs and exploit their interest in these dramatic events. Documentary sources mention vendors selling food and drink at execution sites, particularly for high-profile cases that attracted large crowds. A 10th century account describes how sellers of bread and ale set up their stalls near the execution ground when a notorious criminal was to be punished, suggesting these events created significant commercial opportunities for local merchants. More specialized economies emerged around the souvenirs and relics associated with execution. Items connected to the executed, particularly those put to death for political or religious reasons, could acquire significant value as curiosities or even as objects believed to possess magical properties. A late Anglo-Saxon reference mentions women seeking the hair of the executed thief for use in love magic, indicating a market for such macabre relics. The ropes used in hanging, wood from gallows, and clothing worn by the condemned all feature in documentary sources as items that could be sold following executions. While authorities generally disapproved of such commerce, particularly when it involved veneration of executed criminals, the persistence of references to these practices suggest they remained common throughout the period. This secondary economy around execution created additional economic incentives for maintaining the public nature of punishment. Merchants who profited from the crowds at execution sites had reason to support the continuation of public punishment, while those who sold execution relics benefited from the mystique that surrounded these deadly spectacles. Perhaps the most significant economic aspect of execution involved the confiscation of property from the condemned. Anglo-Saxon law codes explicitly state that serious crimes resulting in execution also led to forfeiture of the criminal's property, creating substantial economic incentives for prosecution and punishment. The laws of King Ethelstan specify that a thief caught in the act forfeits all property to the king, while other Anglo-Saxon legal texts detail how confiscated goods should be divided between various authorities. This confiscation could represent a significant transfer of wealth, particularly when the condemned owned substantial property or valuable goods. The distribution of confiscated property followed hierarchical patterns that reinforced existing power structures. Royal authority claimed the largest share, particularly for serious offenses like treason, while local lords, church authorities, and the community that suffered the crime might receive smaller portions. Documentary sources describe complex formulas for this distribution, reflecting the importance of property confiscation within the overall judicial system. Archaeological evidence occasionally supports these documentary accounts of confiscation.
Execution burials typically lack the grave goods that would normally accompany individuals of their apparent status, suggesting their possessions had indeed been seized before burial. Similarly, evidence from settlement excavations sometimes shows abrupt changes in property occupation consistent with confiscation following criminal proceedings.
The economic value of confiscated property created potential conflicts of interest within the judicial system. Authorities who stood to gain financially from conviction and execution might face temptation to pursue these outcomes regardless of actual guilt. Documentary sources occasionally mention complaints about this aspect of the system, with one 11th century text lamenting that some men are condemned more for their wealth than for their crimes. For lower status individuals with little property, confiscation held less economic significance, but could still devastate their families. The seizure of even modest goods, tools, livestock, household items, might condemn a criminal's dependents to destitution following execution. Some documentary sources suggest provisions for leaving minimal sustenance for families in these cases, though whether such mercy was consistently applied remains unclear. The economy of execution in early medieval London thus operated on multiple levels simultaneously. From the official financial structures of payment and confiscation to the informal economies of vendors and souvenir sellers, execution generated economic activity that helped sustain the practice beyond its ostensible judicial purpose. Understanding these economic dimensions helps explain why public execution persisted as an institution despite changing religious attitudes and growing administrative sophistication. It served economic functions that benefited powerful interests within Anglo-Saxon society. While most executions in early medieval London involved common criminals, the most thoroughly documented cases typically concerned political offenders, those whose crimes challenged royal authority or threatened the established order. These high-profile executions reveal much about how capital punishment functioned as a tool of governance and political control during the Anglo-Saxon period. Treason, betrayal of one's lord or king, represented the most serious political offense in Anglo-Saxon society, where personal bonds of loyalty formed the foundation of social and political order. Documentary sources record numerous cases of execution for treason throughout the period, with particularly detailed accounts emerging from the later Anglo-Saxon era as royal authority strengthened and political competition intensified. The reign of King Ethelred II, the Unready, 978–1016, witnessed several notable treason executions as the king struggled to maintain control amid Viking invasions and internal dissent. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records that in 992, Ethelred ordered the execution of Elfric, an ealdorman, high-ranking nobleman, who had betrayed military plans to Viking forces. While Elfric himself escaped, the Chronicle reports that the king commanded his son's eyes to be put out, a punishment that, while not execution itself, demonstrates the harsh consequences for those associated with traitors. More dramatic still was the St. Brice's Day massacre of 1002, when Ethelred ordered the execution of all the Danish men who were in England. While clearly exaggerated in scope, documentary evidence confirms that numerous Danes were indeed executed on the king's orders,
reflecting both xenophobic sentiment and genuine fears of treasonous collaboration with Viking invaders. Archaeological evidence from mass burials dating to this period, including one discovered at Oxford in 2008, containing approximately 35 males killed by various violent means, may represent victims of this purge. The complex political struggles following Ethelred's reign produced further high-profile treason executions. Perhaps the most notorious involved Edric Striana, ealdorman of Mercia, whose political maneuvering during the contest between Anglo-Saxon and Danish claimants to the throne ultimately led to his execution in 1017.
The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records that King Knut, having secured the throne, had Edric the ealdorman slain in London, very rightly. The Chronicle's approval of this execution highlights how treason was viewed not merely as a crime against the king personally, but against proper social order. Documentary sources provide vivid details about Edric's execution, describing how he was killed in the royal palace and his body thrown over the city wall, then his head placed upon a pole on the highest tower of London. This treatment, execution followed by display of the body parts in prominent locations, became standard practice for traitors, serving both as punishment and as powerful visual propaganda asserting royal authority. Beyond formal treason charges, early medieval London witnessed executions that more nakedly served to eliminate political rivals or enemies. These cases, while often clothed in judicial language, represented the use of execution as a tool of power consolidation rather than impartial justice. The transition period following the death of King Edgar in 975 provides several examples. The struggle between supporters of Edgar's sons, Edward and Ethelred, led to multiple politically motivated killings. While Edward's murder in 978 was not a formal execution, the subsequent punishment of his killers demonstrated how execution could serve political narratives. According to William of Malmesbury's later account, several of those implicated in Edward's death were executed in elaborate ways, their punishments deliberately echoing elements of the original crime. Documentary sources describe how, following Ethelred's accession, his supporters systematically eliminated potential opposition through both judicial and extrajudicial killings. A pattern emerged whereby rivals would be accused of plotting against the king, subjected to rapid trials with predetermined outcomes, and then executed, their property conveniently confiscated and redistributed to loyal supporters. While documentation of specific cases remains limited, the Anglo-Saxon chronicles' repeated references to nobles suddenly slain by order of the king suggests a regular pattern of politically motivated executions. The reign of King Knut, 1016-1035, following the Danish conquest, provides further examples of execution as a political tool. Upon securing the throne, Knut systematically eliminated potential threats among the Anglo-Saxon nobility. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle reports that he ordered to be slain many men of rank, while other sources name specific victims, including the ealdorman, Northman, and Ethelwerd. These executions, while presented as punishment for disloyalty, effectively removed potential focal points for Anglo-Saxon resistance to Danish rule. Archaeological evidence occasionally supports these documentary accounts. Excavations at execution sites have uncovered remains dating to periods of political transition, with some showing signs of high-status individuals subjected to execution.
These findings align with documentary descriptions of political purges following changes of royal power, suggesting that execution served as a standard tool for consolidating new regimes throughout the period. Particularly dramatic cases of political execution involved members of the royal family itself. These rare but significant events revealed the ultimate reach of royal authority and the vulnerability of even the highest status individuals to judicial violence when political circumstances demanded. The most thoroughly documented case from early medieval London involves Ethelred's half-brother, Alderman Elfhelm of Northumbria. Around 1006, Alfhelm, who possessed royal blood through his mother and held significant power in northern England, was invited to a royal feast.
There, according to the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, he was slain by Edric through the instigation of King Ethelred. While not a formal execution, the killing clearly had royal approval and served political purposes similar to judicial execution. More significant than Elfhelm's own death was the fate of his sons, who represented potential claimants to royal power through their bloodline. Documentary sources record that Ethelred ordered them blinded, a common alternative to execution for royal relatives that removed them from political contention while avoiding the taboo of royal bloodshed. One account describes how the princes were blinded with hot irons in London before being imprisoned, where they eventually died from their injuries. An example of how, even when direct execution was avoided, political necessity could still result in deadly outcomes for royal relatives. During Knut's reign, similar dynamics emerged regarding Edmund Ironside's sons, the surviving heirs of the Anglo-Saxon royal line. While Knut initially ordered their execution, he reportedly changed his approach due to concerns about killing royal children directly. Instead, according to the Encomium Emma Regina, he sent them into exile with instructions they should be killed abroad, attempting to distance himself from direct responsibility while achieving the same political outcome. These cases involving royal family members reveal the tension between political necessity and cultural taboos surrounding royal blood. Direct execution of royal relatives remained relatively rare, with alternatives like blinding, mutilation, forced religious consecration, or exile often preferred. These alternatives achieved the political goal of removing threats, while avoiding the most explicit forms of violence against individuals with royal status. Beyond eliminating specific threats, political executions served broader communicative purposes, sending clear messages to various audiences about the consequences of challenging authority. The deliberate staging and publicizing of these executions transformed them from mere punishments into powerful political statements. Documentary sources describe how politically significant executions were conducted with elaborate ceremonies designed to maximize their impact. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle notes that when Knut ordered the execution of prominent nobles in 1017, he ensured it occurred before all the people assembled, making the public witness his power and the consequences of opposition. Similarly, accounts of Edric Striona's execution emphasize how his body parts were displayed in locations guaranteeing maximum visibility. The methods chosen for political executions often carried symbolic significance. Beheading, the separation of the head, associated with thought and leadership, served as an appropriate punishment for those who had mentally conceived treason. Display of severed heads on poles not only warned others, but symbolically elevated the authority that had conquered the traitor.
Even the locations selected for political executions carried meaning, with prominent city gates, bridges, and central gathering places chosen to ensure the political message reached the widest possible audience. The timing of political executions often coincided with significant events or periods of vulnerability, when demonstrations of authority proved particularly necessary. Documentary sources note clusters of executions following royal successions, before military campaigns, or during periods of social unrest, suggesting strategic timing to reinforce authority precisely when it might otherwise be questioned. The disposal of bodies following political execution also conveyed political messages. While common criminals might be buried in execution cemeteries, political enemies often received more elaborate post-mortem treatment designed to extend their punishment symbolically.
The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle describes how the body of one executed nobleman was first flayed, then beheaded, and his body cast upon a dunghill, a sequence of degradations that continued to communicate royal power even after death. Language used to describe political executions in documentary sources reveals their communicative function. Chronicles frequently employ phrases like, "as a warning to others," that all might see the king's justice, or to demonstrate the fate of traitors, explicitly acknowledging the exemplary purpose of these deaths beyond the punishment of individual offenders. Political executions in early medieval London thus functioned not merely as punishments for specific crimes, but as sophisticated communications of power and authority. Through careful staging, symbolic methods, strategic timing, and deliberate publicity, authorities transformed these deadly events into political theater that reinforced their legitimacy and deterred potential challengers. The detailed documentation of these cases, compared to the relative silence surrounding common criminal executions, itself reflects their significance within Anglo-Saxon political culture. While political executions captured the attention of chroniclers and left the most detailed documentary records, the majority of executions in early medieval London involved common criminals, whose individual stories went largely unrecorded. Archaeological evidence, combined with legal texts and occasional mentions in broader historical sources, allows us to reconstruct the patterns of common criminal execution and the types of offenses that most frequently led ordinary Londoners to the gallows. Theft constituted the most common capital offense in Anglo-Saxon London, reflecting both the serious economic impact of property crime in a subsistence economy and cultural values that viewed theft as a particularly dishonorable action. Anglo-Saxon law codes reveal an evolving approach to punishing theft, with capital punishment increasingly prescribed as the period progressed. The laws of King Ian of Wessex, 688 to 726, established early parameters, prescribing execution for thieves caught in the act or in possession of stolen goods worth more than 8 pence. By the reign of Ethelstan in the 10th century, these provisions had hardened, with his law code stating that any thief over 12 years old who stole goods worth more than 8 pence should be executed without possibility of ransom. Archaeological evidence supports these documentary indications that theft was frequently punished by death. Execution cemetery remains often show evidence of hanging, the standard method for executing thieves, while some contain items like iron restraints or bindings, suggesting the deceased were criminals rather than battle casualties or victims of violence. The enforcement of theft laws appears to have varied by context and the status of both criminal and victim. Documentary sources suggest that stealing from churches, the king, or nobility resulted in particularly harsh treatment,
while theft among lower status individuals might be handled more flexibly. Similarly, repeat offenders faced greater likelihood of execution than first-time thieves, who might initially receive lesser punishments like mutilation. A fascinating glimpse into the reality of theft prosecution comes from the Fonthill Letter, a document from around 900 CE describing a complex property dispute. The letter mentions a slave who stole a belt and fled, noting that had he been captured, he would have faced execution. This casual reference suggests the routine nature of capital punishment for theft during this period, even for relatively modest items.
The specific method of executing thieves, typically hanging, carried symbolic significance. Unlike beheading, which killed quickly and maintained bodily integrity, hanging represented a slower, more degrading death, appropriate for dishonorable crimes like theft. The elevation of the body during hanging may have symbolically referenced the theft itself, an illicit elevation of one's status through taking another's property. Archaeological evidence occasionally provides more individualized glimpses of executed thieves. At Stockbridge Down in Hampshire, excavators discovered an execution cemetery containing an adult male buried with an iron slave collar, potentially indicating a slave executed for theft, exactly as described in documentary sources. Similarly, excavations at Gildown in Surrey revealed burials of individuals with hands apparently bound behind their backs, consistent with execution for theft as described in legal texts. The Lady of the Thames, mentioned previously, may represent a female thief executed according to gender-specific provisions in Anglo-Saxon law. The pattern of prolonged beating before death aligns with documentary descriptions of how female thieves should be punished, a gendered variation on the capital punishment prescribed for theft. Murder and serious violent offenses represented another category of crime frequently punished by execution in early medieval London. The treatment of homicide in Anglo-Saxon law evolved significantly throughout the period, gradually transitioning from a system of compensation to one that more frequently employed capital punishment. Early Anglo-Saxon law codes, such as those of Ethelbert of Kent, treated homicide primarily as an offense requiring weregild, man price, to the victim's family, rather than as a capital crime. This approach reflected the early Anglo-Saxon view of homicide as primarily a harm against the victim's kin, rather than against society or moral order. By the later Anglo-Saxon period, however, certain categories of homicide had become firmly established as capital offenses. The laws of King Alfred distinguish between different types of killing, with premeditated murder or killing by stealth specifically designated for execution rather than compensation. Similarly, killing one's lord, a serious breach of the fundamental loyalty bonds of Anglo-Saxon society, became a non-compensable capital offense. Archaeological evidence for the execution of murderers comes primarily from skeletal remains, showing evidence of execution methods associated with homicide. Beheading, mentioned in documentary sources as appropriate for especially serious forms of murder, appears frequently in execution cemetery remains. At Stockbridge Down, archaeologists discovered multiple individuals who had been decapitated, some with evidence suggesting they had been bound before execution,
treatment consistent with documented procedures for executing murderers. Certain locations became particularly associated with the execution of violent offenders. Documentary sources mention murderers' graves at crossroads and boundaries around London, while place name evidence occasionally preserves these associations. The hangman's oak mentioned in a late Anglo-Saxon charter may represent such a location, specifically associated with the execution of violent criminals. The specific treatment of murderers' bodies after execution appears to have varied according to the nature of their crime. Documentary sources suggest that particularly heinous murderers might be denied burial entirely, their bodies left exposed for birds and beasts, while less egregious cases might receive burial in execution cemeteries but with specific ritual precautions, like prone burial or staking to prevent the return of the dangerous dead.
These precautions against the restless dead appear particularly associated with murderers in both documentary and archaeological evidence. Execution cemetery burials showing evidence of staking or other restraining measures most frequently appear in individuals showing signs of execution methods associated with murder rather than theft, suggesting particular fear of these violent criminals even after death. As Christian moral frameworks increasingly influenced Anglo-Saxon law during this period, certain sexual and moral offenses became subject to capital punishment. While early Anglo-Saxon law codes mention few sexual crimes as capital offenses, by the later period, adultery, incest, and various forms of sexual perversion had been added to the list of potentially capital crimes. Documentary evidence for the execution of sexual offenses comes primarily from ecclesiastical rather than secular sources, reflecting the Church's growing influence in this domain. Penitentials, handbooks detailing appropriate penances for sins, occasionally mention execution as the secular consequence for certain sexual offenses, even as they prescribe spiritual remedies for the soul. The Penitential of Theodore, compiled in the late 7th century, notes that civil law prescribed death for a woman who commits adultery with a married man, while the later Old English penitential states that incest between close relatives could result in execution. These sources suggest a gradual expansion of capital sexual offenses under Church influence, though whether these prescriptions were regularly enforced remains unclear. Archaeological evidence specifically linking remains to execution for sexual offenses remains tentative. However, female remains in execution cemeteries who show evidence of drowning or beating rather than hanging may represent victims of these gender-specific capital punishments for sexual transgressions. The differential treatment of male and female bodies in execution contexts potentially reflects the gendered nature of sexual offense prosecution. Beyond explicitly sexual offenses, certain moral transgressions involving deception or oath-breaking could also result in execution. Perjury, particularly in serious cases, appears in later Anglo-Saxon law codes as potentially capital, while documentary sources occasionally mention execution for counterfeiting or forgery, offenses that combined theft with deception.
The methods employed for executing those convicted of sexual or moral offenses often carried symbolic significance. Drowning, associated with cleansing, appeared particularly linked to sexual offenses that were viewed as forms of pollution. Similarly, burning, prescribed in some later sources for sexual perversions, symbolically purified through fire, removing the moral contamination the offender represented. The treatment of the bodies of those executed for moral offenses shows particular concern with separation from the community. Documentary sources mention burial at significant distances from settlements or at boundaries, while archaeological evidence shows some potential moral offenders buried with distinctive treatments suggesting their dangerous or polluting nature. Accusations of witchcraft or maleficium, harmful magic, represented another category of capital offense in early medieval London, though evidence suggests such cases remained relatively rare compared to theft or murder. The treatment of witchcraft evolved significantly throughout the Anglo-Saxon period, reflecting the complex interaction between older Germanic magical traditions and Christian perspectives on illicit supernatural practices. Early Anglo-Saxon law codes make little mention of witchcraft as a specific offense, suggesting initial tolerance or indifference toward
magical practices. By the later Anglo-Saxon period, however, both secular and ecclesiastical sources show increasing concern with harmful magic. The laws of Edward and Guthrum, early 10th century, specifically mention death as the punishment for witches and magicians who cause death through their arts. Archaeological evidence potentially linked to witchcraft executions includes burials with unusual treatments suggesting fear of the deceased, prone burials, decapitations with the head placed between the legs, and evidence of staking or other restraining measures all appear in execution cemetery contexts, though definitively connecting these treatments specifically to witchcraft accusations remains challenging. The gender dynamics of witchcraft accusations in early medieval London appear complex. While the later medieval and early modern stereotype of the female witch had not yet fully developed, documentary sources suggest women faced particular scrutiny regarding certain types of magical practice, especially those involving poisoning or domestic harm. The Old English word for witch, witche, feminine form, appears more frequently in legal texts than its masculine equivalent, Wicca, suggesting a degree of gender bias in prosecution. Methods for executing those convicted of witchcraft varied according to gender, status, and the specific nature of the alleged magical offense. Documentary sources mention burning for particularly serious cases involving demonic pacts, a method that would become increasingly associated with witchcraft in later periods. Other sources prescribe drowning, particularly for women accused of harmful magic, while beheading appears to be associated with higher status individuals accused of magical crimes. The treatment of bodies following execution for witchcraft shows distinctive patterns reflecting fear of continued magical harm. Documentary sources mention specific precautions, like burying witches at crossroads with stakes through their bodies, or in some cases, burning the corpse entirely to prevent any possibility of return. These practices align with archaeological evidence showing unusual post-mortem treatments in some execution burials. A particularly revealing glimpse into witchcraft execution comes from the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle entry for 1046,
which records that witch women, Wickon, were drowned at London Bridge during the reign of Edward the Confessor. This rare specific mention of execution for witchcraft in London itself suggests both the reality of such executions and their relatively memorable nature compared to more routine punishments for common crimes. Common criminal executions, while less thoroughly documented than their political counterparts, thus formed the majority of capital punishment in early medieval London. The archaeological record, combined with legal texts and occasional historical mentions, reveals a system that increasingly employed execution for a widening range of offenses as the Anglo-Saxon period progressed. From theft and murder to sexual transgressions and witchcraft, various behaviors could lead ordinary Londoners to face the ultimate punishment, their anonymous deaths forming the foundation of the execution system that would evolve into London's later reputation as the City of Gallows.